Mike, I'm in the midst of some house renovation, right? And I'm a complete novice at DIY. So I've enlisting the help of some of those apps like TaskRabbit. And I got onto TaskRabbit and it asked me this question, right? So I want to pose it to you.
All right.
The app prompts me with, I need help with.
So
what do you need help with?
That's a long list, Ben. That is a big list. But I think what I will say is that right before we started recording, we did some prep and then we took a little break and I started my laundry. And I think we're going to be discussing laundry in a few different contexts today. So I will say I will need help with folding my laundry after this podcast is done.
Nice.
How about you? What do you need help with?
Well, likewise, apart from, understanding how to paint and to tile and all the rest of it, I need help with understanding when is a block not a block? and when does Elon get to decide? That's what I need help with. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. This week's episode is brought to you with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund and sponsored by Modulate, the pro-social voice technology company making online spaces safer and more inclusive. We've got a really exciting chat with Mike Papas, Modulate's CEO, later on today. He's going to be talking about the interesting question of whether to build or buy trust and safety tools, which is a growing topic of conversation in the space. But right now, I'm here with Mike Masnick, the other Mike, the original Mike.
And the old Mike.
I'm not making any jokes about your age. I know how that goes down. How are you doing? How's your week been?
Oh, it's been good. It's been super busy. Lots of stuff going on, as always. And it's just everything's been kind of crazy and nonstop.
Yeah, we were kind of saying before we started recording that we could have recorded 2 podcasts about the number of stories we had this week. There's an awful lot, even more than usual, I'd say, and lots of really quality reporting and interesting stories to talk about, right?
Yeah. So we were saying at some point, we're going to have to add the midweek special extra episode. But for now, I do think we have plenty of good stuff to cover in the meantime.
Yeah.
And we should mention, by the way, I think it's important to note, next week we are going to be off. We have been able to do a podcast every single week, even the week we had planned to take off in July for July 4th, because the Supreme Court forced me into a motel room to record a quick special episode. But next week we'll be off, but we'll be back the week after.
Yeah, right. And just to confirm, we won't be doing a midweek podcast. I'm worried the listeners will think they've got to catch up even more content moderation news, which isn't the case, but there's a lot going on. We've also had some really nice reviews again this week, Mike, and we've had a bunch of people get in touch in response to my request for info about where they listen to Ctrl-Alt-Speech and what they're doing while they're listening.
Laundry comes up.
It keeps coming up, right? It keeps coming up. And I think it's probably because podcasts generally are an accompaniment to boring tasks like laundry. I don't think it's just Ctrl-Alt-Speech, but there's a few other ones as well. We got some nice responses from folks saying they went on long walks while listening to the podcast. And my favorite one was a listener who said that they were deboning a turkey carcass in preparation for Thanksgiving. They were making a soup. So I thought it was a kind of nice selection of responses.
Yeah. Can you imagine listening to us while deboning a turkey?
Did you think that the person imagines us as the turkey?
I don't know if I want to go there.
I also got some really nice responses from folks about the pedestrian flags. So I'd never seen these pedestrian flags, and we had a few listeners. Thanks, John, for sending in photos of some pedestrian flags from Seattle. They actually exist. You weren't pulling my leg.
I was being entirely honest with you. I have seen them in multiple places, and they exist. And now you've seen pictures of them at least. But at some point, I have to imagine that they must exist somewhere in the UK also.
I don't know. I will make a pledge to, if there is pedestrian flags in the UK, I will find them and I will track them down.
We'll get a picture of you standing waving a flag. I think that's where we need to go.
Okay. Great stuff. So, if people want to share where and how they listen to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, get in touch with us. We've got some messages on Blue Sky. We also got some emails, podcast@ctrlaltspeech.com. We will get back to you, and we thank you for your inputs as ever. Right, Mike. So we are jumping straight into the many stories that we have this week. We both like a good news story. We both like a kind of interesting, relevant news lead, but we also like stories that are a bit more interactive, a bit more interesting. I don't know if you remember the days of Snowfall, the New York Times'
Yes.
very interactive piece from 2012. Your first one is not dissimilar to that, I'd say.
Yeah.
It's a great tale, and it's told really nicely online. Talk us through what that is.
Yeah, so this is from NBC News, and it's by Brandy Zadrozny, who, if you don't know, hopefully listeners of this podcast know Brandy. She's one of the best reporters out there on mis and disinformation, and has done a ton of amazing work on that over the years. So this is a brand new article that just came out this week on how Russian propaganda reaches and influences the U.S., and it's a very interactive, well-done piece in that Snowfall style, the modern version of Snowfall. And it's just talking about how Russian disinformation campaigns start, and basically like how they are creating all sorts of different bits of nonsense and just sort of sending it out into the world through this process, creating fake videos, sometimes AI generated, sometimes it appears maybe hiring actors to play roles of people, sort of confessing things and just making up complete nonsense stories. And then it sort of follows through as to where those stories go and how they filter onto fake news sites that Russian folks have set up, how they find various trolls on the site formerly known as Twitter. And then often it sort of launders its way up through the chain until eventually someone like a JD Vance or a Donald Trump might repeat them. And so it actually follows one particular story that was completely made up regarding Ukrainian officials that are close to Zelensky buying very expensive yachts, and sort of implying that US money that is going into Ukraine is being laundered through various people to purchase expensive yachts for Zelensky. And that then sort of, filtered its way through and again laundered its way up the chain to the point that at one point JD Vance sort of mentioned it on some podcast that he was on, that we shouldn't, why are we sending more money to Ukraine for them to buy expensive yachts, which was a thing that did not happen.
Right.
But because it sort of started from Russian disinformation and made its way along through nonsense peddling American trolls on Twitter, eventually JD Vance picks it up because that's kind of the world that he lives in. And then suddenly there's like this legitimate question of, oh, wait, are Ukrainian officials buying yachts with American funding? And it's a really well done story. And it's really it's a very interactive presentation. The presentation is really fantastic. And they sort of show how they're doing this with a whole bunch of stories, and most of which aren't catching on at all, but a few of them are actually breaking through.
Yeah, this is what's so wild about this piece, is the scale at which this group is doing this work and the systematic nature of it, right? It's huge in terms of its scale. And like you say, not many stories make it through, but when they do, they really hit. The story that's mentioned as well about a kind of Ukrainian man who's a kind of actor who apparently confesses to trying to assassinate Tucker Carlson for $4,000 while Tucker Carlson's in Moscow. Absolutely wild, and comes with a whole array of fake images of burner phones and pictures of Tucker Carlson in Moscow, and all packaged up in a really, if you don't know any different, believable way. What do we know about this kind of group that's behind this, and how kind of concerning is it that so many stories are getting through into the mainstream, do you think?
Yeah. So, there have been a few different sort of groups related to doing all these things people know about, like the Internet Research Agency, which was the one that sort of became famous 8 years ago. This one in particular is from this group called Storm 1516. And they're creating a bunch of these things, and they're somehow, connected to Russian officials. But it seems like there's not that much information directly on the group, but they're able to produce these really impressive things. And then the example you gave of the Tucker Carlson story, like that got picked up by a bunch of American sources. And interestingly, there was a story about a month ago, which I don't think we actually covered it on the podcast, about, U.S. officials charged people associated with RT, Russia Today, the sort of, Russian propaganda news outlet. And they had been funding these American YouTube influencers like Tim Pool and Benny Johnson and folks like that to ridiculous amounts. Maybe we did mention it, actually.
Yeah, I think we did briefly.
We briefly mentioned it. And those are, notably in this story, those are the same people who picked up on this story about Tucker Carlson supposedly being targeted for assassination, and they all ran with it. And so there's this whole ecosystem that has been created to sort of launder this Russian propaganda. And there's a little bit that I hesitate when talking about this story, because we heard there were similar arguments made over the last 8 years, really 9 years, about like Russian propaganda and who it influences. And there's evidence that it doesn't actually do much to influence people in some ways. But the thing that it seems clearly to do, and as the campaigns are becoming more sophisticated, I think the real sort of takeaway from this is that the campaigns are being more sophisticated. But it really shows how much of the disinformation world is really about confirmation bias. It is so much about not necessarily convincing people, but taking people who already think this must be happening or these bad things must be going on and giving them something to feed off of and just say, like, yes, well, this story confirms my priors and therefore it feels true and therefore it must be true. And I think people have made this point before, but I think it's one that's worth reminding people and thinking about it. Last week we were talking about like risks versus harms, but I think, sort of a related issue is the confirmation bias at the heart of so many of these discussions about online speech and dis and misinformation, is that it's really all about confirmation bias and people looking for content to support what they want to believe. And what we're creating in this ecosystem right now are tools to support anyone's bias and to give them content that allows them to accept it. And we're all guilty of it. Like lots of people would say like, oh, well, I'm better than that. But that's not true. I mean, I think everybody at some point falls for some nonsense because they want it to be true and it fits with their prior beliefs on something. But here, what we're seeing when the campaigns get this big and this advanced is it gets easier for people who want to believe these things to take them and to expand them further. And because they're so sophisticated and because they're so advanced and they're creating these videos with all this supporting documentation, even though it's all 100% fake and 100% made up, it's easier for these things to sort of catch on and become stories in some form or another. And then the one other interesting thing that I think is coming out of it is that none of these stories, even the ones that have broken through, and a lot of these stories they note like just didn't catch on at all, but even the few that did catch on didn't go huge. Like they weren't like these big disinformation campaigns, but they just sort of like creep in. Like even I mentioned JD Vance mentioning the Ukrainian yachts or whatever.
Right.
He just mentions that in passing in a podcast. It doesn't become a major story, but it's just one of these things where he's making these arguments about the funding for Ukraine right now and saying like, oh, do we want that funding to go towards more Ukrainian yachts? That's not the major point of the story, but it just sort of filters into the general narrative.
Is there, apart from people being more immune to narratives like this and being aware of how stories get laundered through this system, which is really clear from this piece, are there other ways that we could kind of like slow the spread of information through this chain, do you think? Are there ways of spotting it, dots that we can trace maybe in the system? Because it's really tough for anybody to be so on top of all of the different narratives out there that they're not captured by one of the many, many narratives that have been perpetuated by these Russian organizations. How can we slow this down a bit more or stymie some of the spread?
I mean, I think there's a few different things. So one, and this is the thing that I always go back to, and it always feels like sort of a cheap shot, but media literacy is incredibly important. And again, I just said like confirmation bias, everybody falls prey to it at some point. I've done it. I'm sure you've done it. Like there are stories that you just want to believe, and so you fall for it. But having general media literacy and sort of recognizing like, is this coming from a trustworthy source? What are the details? Who is reporting it? Really matters. And learning like when to be skeptical, especially of things that confirm your priors, is a really important skill. It's not one that anyone will ever be perfect at, but training people on that I think is important. The second thing is just sort of recognizing media ecosystems. And this is something that is really, really important. In the sort of reality-based world,
Sounds fun.
I'm trying to choose words diplomatically here, but like in the reality-based world, mistakes are made. Reporters make mistakes. News organizations make mistakes. We recognize that. But when those mistakes are discovered, they tend to recognize that, admit that, talk about it, make corrections, and do things like that. In the sort of pure nonsense peddling world, which now exists, what they will do is not do that, right? I mean, they will spin stories, they will take fake stories, they will take real stories. I mean, a lot of these stories will come with a grain of truth behind them because that allows them to sort of obfuscate and present these things in a way that presents a darker picture than the reality says. I mean, we've seen that with things like the Twitter files and the Hunter Biden laptop, which, you know, has been totally misrepresented over time. But those sort of start with a grain of truth. But the ecosystems that are pushing those messages, you'll notice that they don't issue corrections. They don't hold each other to account. They don't admit when they have these kinds of failings. They sort of try and cover it up. They don't mention it again, or they sort of dismiss it as like, oh, well, you know, we had just heard that, you know, we were just reporting what somebody else said rather than admitting that there was a mistake made. So I think there's an element of like watching the media ecosystem that you are engaged with and seeing how they handle when mistakes are made or when false things are reported or misleading things are reported.
Yeah.
And that is a key indicator for me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of great quotes in this piece from kind of the right-wing grifters who not only have made money by being paid directly by Russia through the fake company that you mentioned, but also making money, obviously, through the monetization of videos about rumors like this. So they're benefiting twice. But there's some great quotes, you know, where they say, we actually reported it as being a hoax. And we noted at the time that it wasn't possible to verify the claim. It's like, that would have been if anything, a scintilla of a second in which they mentioned it.
Yes.
And then they would have moved on and they would not have gone back to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the quotes someone said at one point was like, you know, they reported on it, and then at the end they were just like, you know, we have no real way of verifying this, but, you know, we thought it was important. It's like, that is not really a good way to handle this kind of thing.
And there's a bigger conversation which we should come back to. I'm really interested in, from the work I do in my day job, around what are the kind of signals that content creators and influencers, inverted commas, what kind of ethics and transparency should they have, and how should the platforms rank them or distribute them according to those kind of journalistic principles is something that I think a lot of platforms are thinking about. Great. We'll share that story in the show notes. It's definitely something to go and have a read of. It's really interesting to kind of scroll through and see the different elements. But we'll move now on to our second story about laundry and about laundering. Piece that came out this week as well. Really fantastic piece by Daphne Keller from Stanford, who stood in for me a couple of weeks ago on the podcast.
Yep.
She's written for Lawfare about the rise of the compliant speech platform. And it's a long read. It's definitely worth spending time with. There's lots of great elements to it. Essentially, Daphne speaks to around 100 kind of trust and safety experts, and she's pulled together all the insights from that to basically make the argument that content moderation is becoming a compliance function, much like banks have compliance functions and factory floors have to be compliant to kind of keep workers safe. Trust and safety is now moving in that direction. And her argument is that the regulation that has been introduced over the last few years, the Digital Safety Act, the Digital Services Act, the Online Safety Act, and the Code of Practice for Online Services in Singapore have created these conditions where platforms are essentially having to be able to report on everything they do, all the decisions that they make. They're having to standardize how they work. They're having to make all of the decisions trackable. It's a big part of the DSA is that the takedown decisions are recorded in a database. And that's creating a whole ecosystem around auditing those decisions and tracking whether those processes are being followed correctly. And she kind of makes the case that this is essentially compliance. And she goes on to say that there are a bunch of downsides to this, which are ones that we talk about a lot on the podcast, which are definitely worth noting and somewhat concerning around government having overdue influence into speech rules on platforms, about how there's a kind of overdue focus on metrics and following the right process, even if the outcome isn't the best for users or for society as a whole. And so, you know, it's a really great kind of original piece of reporting, I'd say, which we both read and we both thought, yeah, this is great, and we have to talk about it on the podcast. So here we are.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it is a really valuable contribution to the way of thinking about this and understanding all of these things. And I think, like Daphne, have some concerns about it. There's an argument, and I can't remember again if I've made this argument directly on this podcast before, that I think that there's an important role in having companies and top executives at companies thinking of trust and safety specifically as a really important sort of marketing function that is important centrally to the company. I think that a lot of companies think of trust and safety as a cost center. And we see that, like, there are layoffs all the time. You have to hire a whole bunch of people. And it's a pain that is frustrating to many company executives. And that comes through when you see them testify or when they talk about these things, or Mark Zuckerberg's recent comments on this stuff. I think he sees trust and safety as just a nuisance and a cost center for Meta. And it reminds me of the way that companies 20, 30 years ago viewed customer service. It was a cost center. You have to spend all this money on people who will answer calls from angry customers, and you want to get them off the phone as quickly as possible and not have to deal with their complaints. And then some companies began to come around to the idea that, wait a second, like, this is one of the major touch points we have between our company and our customers. This is where they are interacting with us. This is where they're communicating with us. Customer service itself is actually a marketing function. It is a way for us to present a good side of what we do to our customers, and therefore we should invest in it because that will come back in the future in support. And the argument I keep making is that we need to move trust and safety to that kind of role, where it is seen as, we are making this platform better. And in the long run, that means more users, more advertisers, more whatever, because we are making the platform better. That's what a trust and safety role should be. It should be seen as an investment, not as a cost sink. And my worry is that as trust and safety moves more and more into being a compliance function, it goes further and further away from that. It is again seen as like, okay, these are the boxes we need to check to make the regulators happy. Not, this is what is actually best for our users. This is what is going to create a better internet, a better service, a better whatever overall. Whereas if we could get the companies to recognize that this is in their best interest, not because the auditors say so, not because the regulators say so, but because it is actually better for the long-term health of the wider internet and the services themselves, that would be better. So my reaction to this is, I think it's great contribution and I think it's accurate and really important, but I worry that this sort of capitulation to the idea of it being a compliance function actually takes us further from the world that we want.
Yeah. I mean, I do like the idea of trust and safety being like customer experience and it going in that direction. But what's the downside, do you think, of it being more like compliance? Like if it doesn't go that way?
Yeah, I mean, some of this comes out. It's kind of funny as you read Daphne's piece that, like, everybody is tiptoeing around the idea that, like, we're not setting the rules. We're not telling you what to leave up or take down. But, like, we have all these things that you need to do in order to make it work. And so what happens when you have that sort of situation, you have auditors involved, what everyone is trying to do is basically just cover their ass so that if there's a lawsuit, they can say, well, we did everything by the book. We did the things that the auditors told us to do, that the regulators indicated were okay, or in some cases where there have been previous court cases or previous fines, we followed the rules that everybody else laid out. And so then it's just an issue of checking boxes as opposed to actually doing what's right. It is what is going to decrease the liability on us, what is going to decrease the legal risk. When you have auditors involved, that's what you're talking about, not what is actually going to be the best for the internet and for the users of the internet and for their speech. And there is the potential that those two things align, that what the government wants, what the auditors suggest, and what is best for the users and for speech align. But historically, we haven't really seen that play out. And so that's where my fear is.
Yeah. I mean, I Daphne mentions banking in her piece. And I wonder if compliance is actually that bad, and if banking hasn't shown us that compliance isn't that bad. I slightly disagree with kind of where you're coming from, and I just want to explain why. So banks pre-2008 were not dissimilar to tech platforms in some sense, right? They had a lot of users, they were processing a lot of personal data, they were going through millions of transactions every day, they had a lot of kind of wealth and money involved, and they were very central to people's lives. Not hugely dissimilar to platforms in some sense. 2008 happens, the trust in banks kind of completely disappears, there's calls for regulation, and naturally there's pushback from the banks. And so they will start to say things that we actually have heard quite recently, right? So that regulation would affect the bank's ability to lend to consumers and would affect the growth of economies and businesses. It would make it difficult to sustain their own operations because there'd be an administrative burden on regulation. And it would make it easy for larger banks to sustain a place in the market because smaller banks wouldn't be able to kind of comply in the same way. And then what happened was all of these regulations got introduced, right? So you had all of these frameworks introduced for systemic risks. You had a bunch of transparency required around certain markets. You had consumer protection for certain products. And now we all know and understand that banks are regulated. And I wonder if that is a not dissimilar place to where we are now, which is compliance is a cost of doing business. If you want to get into the speech space, you have to do all of these things. And actually, it's only because there is a big pushback against it that we actually think differently about speech and about the kind of state of online speech right now. Your thoughts?
Oh boy. All right. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of differences. And so one, the banking space was very heavily regulated before that. Yes, the regulations have changed and they have certainly advanced, but it was certainly not a Wild West of regulation-free stuff. The banking industry has long been a heavily regulated industry. Also, many of the concerns that were raised about some of those banking regulations have actually proven true. I mean, we are now a year and a half since Silicon Valley Bank, which is the bank with which my company did business, was all their accounts were frozen and all of my company's money was frozen.
Oh shit. I didn't realize that.
It was quite an experience. It was actually, this is the funny story, was the day that happened was a day that we had an offsite to work on the Trust and Safety Tycoon game, which came out last year with lots. And so we had
great game. Go and play it.
Gone up north to this very nice house that a friend of ours had rented with this amazing view. And in the morning before I left to drive up, I saw the news about Silicon Valley Bank basically being shut down and freaked out. And that was not a comforting offsite. And we did not get as much work done because I spent a whole bunch of time in this beautiful house on the phone trying to figure out if our bank account's money was available to us. Okay. So, and since then, of course, there's been a lot of looks into what's happening with the U.S. banking system and how poorly targeted some of those regulations were and how they actually have, the end result of this was like Silicon Valley Bank got taken over by a larger bank and other larger banks also have sort of, there's been a lot of consolidation and it has actually slowed down certain things and it has created some problems. And on top of that, the even more important thing is like, even though in some cases, and I know this is one that like sets people off, in some cases, money can be equated with speech and expression. That's a whole other area that we are not about to go down into. But in general, money and speech are not the same thing. And so regulating money and how people hold money is a wholly different thing than regulating how people can speak and how they can communicate. And so I think that the analogy breaks down after a certain point. And as soon as you're talking about compliance and regulations around speech, the end result, and this is a point that Daphne definitely makes, is that you are going to lead to suppression of certain kinds of speech. And that is always at the core, the concerns that I have about these regulations is what happens. Because as soon as you get into that area, what almost always happens is that the speech that is most heavily regulated and suppressed is speech from marginalized groups, marginalized individuals, people with less power, and the more powerful folks are fine. But people who have more controversial opinions, but important ones, are kept out of it. I mean, we've talked about this where there are attempts to regulate kinds of disinformation that what happens, it leads to pulling down information on LGBTQ content. It leads to pulling down information on healthcare things around abortion. All of these kinds of topics get targeted by these speech regulations. And from the company standpoint, if the idea is just to comply, the easiest thing to do is just say, we're not going to do that. And we're seeing that to some extent, not, this is not getting all the way there, but there is a story that we had talked about doing, which we didn't do, though now I'm bringing it up, around like how Meta, Instagram, and Threads are handling political content, and they're sort of pushing it, they're downranking it and trying to not have it apply, not show up as much within the conversations. And that is a direct result from all the shit that Meta is getting for how it moderates political content. And so they've sort of thrown their hands up and said, it's easier for us not to deal with this content at all. And therefore, we're going to sort of push it down the algorithm. We're not going to block it, but we're not going to have it promoted as widely. And that's a direct response to like people complaining about which content they did promote in the past and them just saying, we just don't want to deal with this anymore. The further and further you get towards creating regulations and compliance burdens for this speech, the more it's going to lead to this kind of speech being suppressed because it's just not worth it.
Yeah, and I do buy the idea that there is going to be an unnecessary blocking, de-ranking, down-ranking of speech, and that concerns me. But I imagine that probably banks said similar things in 2008. And my question is, like, in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, however far we on from those regulations, is the kind of context that users are banking in better than back then? And can you see a situation when this regulation, this compliance agenda, when that actually takes hold, and it looks like it will because we're seeing more and more regulation, government regulation about speech all the time, can you see a situation where the people would adjust to the context and in 10 or 15 years' time have processes to better understand, mitigate in a way that isn't just about downranking or blocking speech as we're all worried about?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. Like, people always adjust to the reality that they have around them. And so I don't think that is, I mean, people will adjust and you don't know what you don't have. So, whatever world we live in, people will say like, yes, this is normal and this is okay. But I think the idea that all the regulations around finance, and I'm not, let me be clear, because it was about to sound like I was saying like, oh, get rid of banking regulations. I'm not saying that. Not saying that.
Do you keep all of your money under the floorboards now because of what happened?
Yeah. But we are still living in a world today where financial scams are massive and all over the place. And you can say that maybe some of the regulations on banking led to the rise in like crypto scams. And now we're talking about pig butchering, which, sort of relies on crypto scamming. There are a bunch of different things like this stuff sort of oozes out somewhere else in the system. The idea that we can sort of perfectly regulate these things is not true because humanity is messy and society is messy and the way that people interact is messy. And so much of these regulations, and again, I'm not making the argument for no regulations. I'm not saying get rid of them, but I'm saying recognize that there are consequences to these regulations, and the unintended consequences lead to, the problems ooze out somewhere else.
Yeah.
And we should be very careful about where and how those problems ooze out, and don't assume that just because like the world itself doesn't collapse, that these approaches are necessarily the right way to do it.
Yeah. Okay. As you can see from the discussion we've had, it's a great piece. I definitely recommend listeners go and have a read. Daphne's done a great job of adding something new. And we could go on and talk about it for a lot longer, but we have other stories to get to. We've gone, Mike, from there from a very thoughtful, well-argued piece by somebody who's really trying to add to the debate to somebody who is the antithesis of that. We're back talking about Elon Musk.
Yeah.
We're back talking about Elon Musk. And what's he done this week? What can we be angry about?
Well, I was about to say, because, I wrote an article about this, and I think we're going to link to my article in the show notes. So I thought you were about to say we went from a thoughtful piece by Daphne to a terrible, stupid piece by you, Mike.
Never. I'd never say that.
But Elon has continued his belief in changing what used to be called Twitter to his liking, and without any thought to whether or not it actually makes sense. And so he did two big things this week. One is changing the terms of service that will go into effect in mid-November in ways that have raised some eyebrows. But the bigger one, the more noticeable one, is that while he's talked about this in the past, they've announced officially that they are changing how the block feature works on X, where formerly, when you block someone, they can't see what you're doing and they can't interact with you. And if anyone else interacts with, it's all blocked. He's never like that. And so now the way it is going to happen is that if someone blocks you, you can still see their content. You just won't be able to interact with it. You won't be able to reply. You won't be able to retweet it, but you can still see it. And there is, to give him a very, very, very tiny amount of
Don't do
credit.
it, Mike. Don't do it. There's no need.
There is a non-crazy way to think about this. And that is basically when people are posting to a public system, that content is public and anyone can see it, right? If I post something to TechDirt, I can't ban someone from seeing what I've written. If you write something and everything in moderation, you can't ban someone from seeing it. It is public, and therefore there's just a general sense that anyone can see it. And this is the point that everyone always raises with the way that Twitter does blocks, or did blocks, which is that, if somebody blocks you, you can just go into incognito mode and you can see that content because it's public. And so block is sort of a weird function on social media. So the theory is like, well, this changes that. Because it's public, it remains public. But the reality is very different than the theory on this. And the reality is that friction that the block function adds makes a real difference in slowing down abuse and harassment of a variety of different kinds of
it's a first line of defense in a lot of cases, isn't it, to people being targeted in some way?
Exactly. And it's not perfect by any means, but it's not meant to be. It is just an attempt to add some friction. And often, not always, often that amount of friction is enough to make a difference in very important ways. And so it works for some element of what it is trying to deal with, and not everything. And what Musk is doing is sort of removing it for a large segment of the population for which it actually does work.
Mm.
And so the history here is also important, which is that 11 years ago, Dick Costolo, who was CEO of Twitter at the time, had the exact same idea and had the exact same thought that block is stupid and we should change that. And he did the same thing. He turned it so that you couldn't interact with people, but you could still see people who blocked you. It lasted for, I think, 2 hours before the revolt was so loud and so angry and so public that they rolled it back and never spoke about it again. As far as I know, there was never any post-mortem. There was no discussion of it. There was we're rolling it back. We're sorry. We're going to rethink this. And then it was never mentioned again.
Right. Elon doesn't do post-mortems.
No. And I mean, Elon at times will roll stuff back. So it'll be interesting to see if that history repeats itself. I am pretty sure that Elon has no idea that Twitter tried this before and that it failed miserably and was a complete disaster and an embarrassment for Twitter at the time. And we are starting to see there is pushback. I have even seen people who are normally big supporters of Elon have been screaming about what a stupid idea this is. And we're seeing a big exodus from Twitter to other sites. And so people are recognizing that this is a problem and they don't like the way the site works.
Yeah, you were saying before we started recording that Blue Sky's had this massive surge in users, which we're kind of tallying with the changes to block, right? And this is where I ring the Mike Masnick.
Yes.
bell.
Disclaimer. I am on the board of Blue Sky. I am associated with Blue Sky. Consider me biased. Do not take what I am saying as impartial for the next section here.
And no, he can't block people on the platform for you or unban you. Don't get in touch with them.
Yes. Please don't. But yes, Blue Sky has seen a massive influx in users, like even bigger. Blue Sky saw a huge influx of users when Brazil banned Twitter, and a whole, basically, we jumped up about 4 million users in the course of a couple of weeks from that ban. This is larger than that as of right now. I don't know if it will last as long, but right before we started recording, I looked at the US App Store iPhone downloads, and Blue Sky was the number 4 free app being downloaded, which is pretty impressive. We were one ahead of TikTok, ahead of Instagram, ahead of WhatsApp, ahead of Gmail. The only ones that we were behind were Threads, which also I believe. Lots of people are probably going to Threads, ChatGPT, and Google. So having Blue Sky, this very small player in the space, being the fourth most downloaded app, almost. And it was reported, this is not me revealing anything internal that I'm aware of, but it was reported publicly that within Blue Sky, they refer to EME, which are Elon Musk events that suddenly lead to a massive influx of users on the platform. And so it's interesting to see like how these traces, and I'll note again, bias, all of that, all the caveats. Blue Sky implements block in a very different way, and in fact goes further than Twitter did before. It is referred to as the nuclear block on Blue Sky, where when you block someone, it obliterates every interaction that you have with that person. Whereas with blocks on Twitter, the way they have worked for a very long time is that even if you block someone, other people can still track the conversation that you had. Right. They can sort of see what happened. On Blue Sky, it basically disappears, and it is effectively impossible to track down, and it stops harassment campaigns cold. Like, it is a very, very impactful way of doing it. There are some ways around some of it, but they throw a lot more friction into the gears, and it's really powerful. And it sort of clued me into how these very small changes and how these things are implemented have huge impact in terms of how harassment campaigns can and cannot work on different platforms.
Yeah. And are we taking the influx of users to Blue Sky to mean that people are interested in how platforms think about safety? Is it something that we think is a kind of conscious decision for users, or do you think there's people are just shopping around for alternatives?
I don't know the answer, and so this would be purely speculation. I think that it's just a sense that, yes, that some of the safety features matter. I mean, we saw this early on with Blue Sky. When Blue Sky first launched as a beta, it was a private beta, invite only. The first sort of controversy was that they hadn't yet implemented block at all. Right. They were just sort of testing out the system, and there were like 5,000 people on the platform, and people were so angry. How could you launch this without block? Like, block was is now considered a fundamental feature of social media, which is kind of surprising because it was not originally. That was a later addition to all of this. And as we see, even Twitter sort of was rethinking how it works. But in our minds now, people have sort of learned to associate blocking as a fundamental key safety feature of social media that social media needs.
Yeah.
Then how it's implemented really matters. And whereas Blue Sky's gone for this nuclear block, Twitter, or X, is now moving in this opposite direction of the loosest level of block that you could possibly imagine. Something is much more akin to the concept of muting rather than blocking. And so it's really interesting. And I hope that we'll find out more of the reasons why people are switching. But that seems to be the clear reason why we're seeing this massive, massive influx to Blue Sky. And I am assuming that Threads and also Mastodon are probably seeing a similar influx of people. And I think it's great. I think exploring all of these different systems and recognizing that now you have choices in terms of which systems do you think are going to do the most to keep you safe and make you feel comfortable on a platform. I think that's actually a really good thing.
Yeah, no, it's great that there's alternatives out there that people feel they can even try. Obviously, last week we had a story about Threads and Instagram moderation being below par. There being a lot of oddities to the moderation process as a result of presumed moves to AI. And actually, this is a kind of nice segue onto what will be probably a final story for this week, Mike, but a bit of an update to the explanation for those technical glitches.
Yeah, so they came out and said that, we did our whole discussion on it and talked about how it was obviously AI because it was so stupidly done and like blocking everyone who used the word cracker, without understanding any of the context, and how like Cracker Jacks are a snack food and not a racial insult. So we assumed naturally that it was an AI-driven thing because that was the only thing that made sense. But Instagram came out, and Adam Mosseri came out and said that it was a human reviewer problem and that they had not properly instructed human reviewers on how to handle certain kinds of context and things like that. And I'm not sure I believe them.
Well, I mean, there's a few parts to this. Like, you don't believe him, right? And so you think he's putting the emphasis on humans because it's in his interest to like disown the human part of this moderation process. I think actually there's something here about the kind of tooling that the humans were enabled with. Like he mentioned about that the tools didn't give it the humans context. Humans aren't going to be able to kind of moderate effectively if they don't have context about something. So whether or not you're right or it's a tooling aspect, it's not the fact that there's people involved in the process, right?
Yeah, that is true. And we know that the tools do matter. But again, like, kind of what we said last week was that it is insane that Meta, the sort of most experienced and the largest resourced player in trust and safety, would have tools that were so bad. And we were talking about on the AI front. But if that's also true in terms of like the tools for the moderators, that they don't have the context. I understand, like, tools for context are a difficult thing, and it's something I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about. It's difficult.
Yeah.
Because context can come in all different ways and could be external to the content that you're looking at, could be external to the platform itself. But not knowing that Crackerjack is not a slur.
Yeah, the tool has to have been designed very badly in the first place.
Yes.
For that to happen.
Yes, that is my take on it. I don't like, that seems like a huge mistake. And for a company as big, like, I could see like a very small player pulling a kind of off the shelf tool somewhere and not really implementing it right, like having that issue. I have that issue a little bit now with like moderating comments on TechDirt. Our tools are not perfect, and there are a couple of things where like context would be really useful that I don't have, and I have to take a few extra steps to look at, like, oh, who's this person replying to, because that actually matters.
Yeah.
But we're tiny, right? And so like Meta is not, right?
Yeah.
I am amazed that they would not have tools in place that could handle basic context.
Yeah. Agreed. And I'm not a big fan of the headline of this article, which we'll include in the show notes, because it does suggest that he doesn't row back on that initial claim, and he does. So anyway, it's a complex issue, as always, with content moderation and trust and safety. I don't know if we've solved any of the issues today, Mike, in the time we've been talking, but
I will say this is actually a really good lead into the bonus chat that I have with Mike Pappas, where this question of buy versus build, there are some issues about how do you choose which things, and like what features do you want, and how customized do they need to be? And that's some of what Mike and I talk about in this bonus chat, because these are not easy questions. These are really, really important ones. And so I think Mike and I get into that in this bonus chat. And so actually, we didn't plan it this way, but it leads in really nicely to the bonus chat between myself and Mike Pappas from Modulate. So, Mike, welcome back to the show. Always good to have you here. Always good to catch up. We wanted to talk today. You recently wrote this blog post on the Modulate site on the issue of building versus buying technology for trust and safety purposes, and in particular around voice moderation, which I think is an issue that really comes up a lot in all sorts of contexts around trust and safety right now. And it's a topic that I heard a lot about at TrustCon, and I hear about in all sorts of other contexts as well when thinking about this stuff. And I was just kind of curious, like, what made you want to write about that topic in the first place?
Thanks for having me back, Mike. Always enjoy having these conversations. The answer to this is, in some sense, pretty mundane. We are a trust and safety tools vendor. So this is an inherent sort of existential question for us, is, does it make sense for people to buy externally? We're a very sort of mission-driven, ethics-driven company. We have a lot of deep internal conversations about how do we want to think about marketing and sales strategy. We don't want to trick someone into buying our product if it's not actually a good fit for them. So I think what's more interesting here is really looking at it from that lens of, can we add a kind of value by being an external organization that you cannot get from sort of spinning up an internal team to build the same tool? And I think what's interesting is that we do feel like there's a couple of areas where we can provide value that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, and this comes up in all sorts of contexts, again, like not just within the trust and safety field. I mean, I think there's lots of areas where everyone is always having that build versus buy conversation. And one of the things that comes up a lot is this idea of like, how central is the thing to your business? And the general sense being, if something is more central to your business, you tend to lean more towards building versus buying. But I'm not always sure that's true, right? I mean, I think there are times where even if something is central, there is value in, if there is an expert who has the ability to do more because of scale or because of expertise or something else, it actually makes more sense to partner with that vendor. And so I'm sort of curious how do you feel about that, or how do you think through those things yourself?
Yeah, I mean, electricity is vital to my business. That doesn't mean I build it myself, right? To your point, there's a lot of things that are essential components. And because of that essentialness, you cannot afford to get it wrong. And I think, as we've seen over the last several years, trust and safety has long been seen as kind of this cost center, this must we do it, and we'll try to do it as little as possible. And as both sort of regulation, consumer sentiment, and frankly, just platforms that care, that are being built around that perspective of caring, are all sort of looking at this and saying, no, actually, we really should treat this as essential. I actually see that coinciding with more of them starting to perk their ears up a little bit and say, let's take a closer look at what else is out there and think about, is it worth getting that really premium offering as opposed to just trying to slap something together to check a box?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this in a slightly different context, and I didn't realize I was going to go down this path when we started this conversation. But you bringing up the idea of people thinking of it as a cost center, this is something that I've actually thought a lot about lately as well, where years ago, I remember there was this whole debate over like call centers and customer support, and a lot of companies viewing that as a cost center. And then somebody, had the bright idea like, wait, this is the main touch point that many of our customers have with our company or their service or products. Maybe we should realize that like customer support is actually a marketing function rather than a cost center that is just causing headaches for us and that we try and keep as cheap as possible. And in that situation too, right? I mean, a lot of people choose to still outsource it because they know that even though it is a really important feature of their business, it still makes sense to outsource it because you can do that at a much better rate. Do you think of it as sort of similar to that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's partly, why we really enjoy working with the kinds of businesses that we do is because they have that conception of this is not just a cost center.
Right.
I mean, games are often built by people who are, visionaries trying to create this particular experience. And it's really emotionally important to them to realize the experience that they had wanted to create. And this is part of it. If as soon as you step into that wondrous world, someone's calling you the N-word, it's not so wondrous anymore, right?
Right.
And I think even with some of the enterprise platforms that we've been working with more recently, we see similarly, it comes from the culture and mentality of the business that if you're the kind of organization that says we want to win by treating people well and by allowing that to elevate them and help them create something even more wonderful, then you're going to start treating trust and safety more as a core component of your business.
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting, and this comes out in the blog post that you wrote, that there are some things that are very specific to the voice space and the work that you do. And, it's funny because I read your blog post on building versus buying, and I'm just like, all of the things that you have to do voice moderation well seems horrifying to me, right? It's just like this huge list of things. And so not that I'm in the space where I need voice moderation, but like for me, it's an easy call. Like there's no way I would want to build. So do you want to talk a little bit about some of the specifics that you sort of discussed in that blog post about what companies should be thinking about specifically in the voice moderation space?
Sure. Yeah, I think broader than voice moderation, it really comes down the build or buy decision to three major components. There's the data. What decisions do you want to make? How can you make the best decisions? There's the technical capability to actually build those tools and have them function. And then there's sort of the user interface. What's the experience of this? Do we know how to make that efficient? In voice, each of those things kind of takes on an extra level, right? In order to get good data, you first of all need it to be voice native data. If you're just looking at transcripts, we've worked with some platforms that took text transcripts and then sent them to, Amazon Mechanical Turk or something and had someone try to read the transcript. You're not getting the emotion. You're not getting any of what we're actually looking for in that voice to really understand it. So if you want to build a proper voice moderation tool, you need data that's native to real conversations between people. This is also where I think you get a benefit from working with an external partner, because we see what's happening across so many different platforms. We can see emerging new trends that haven't reached your ecosystem yet. We can get much broader data sets to be more robust to different kinds of accents and languages. We just have a lot more ability to do that kind of stuff because of the cross section we see. The technical sort of capability, I don't think I need to spell out too much there. Processing voice is really complicated. You need a specialized team on that. But just on the user interface piece, I'll call out for voice and for a lot of content moderation, but it really becomes extra true in voice. Moderator mental health is a consideration you have to make, right? If you're not just seeing this awful stuff, but hearing it over and over again over the course of a day, that can be really brutal. And it can actually lead to physical issues such as tinnitus. So being able to actually process that audio and make sure that if people are listening to it, they're doing it as little as possible. You're pre-processing it so it's not causing physical damage. That kind of extra stuff is also easily missed when someone is just thinking, oh, how can I, spin something up as quickly as possible here?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. There's a few things that are obviously specific to the voice world that I just never even would have thought of as well. It's kind of interesting, a lot of this discussion is really, and obviously, as you mentioned, you're in the vendor space. And so this is an existential question for you. But I'm sort of curious, not as a devil's advocate kind of question, but in which situations do you think it actually does make sense for companies to build their own tools here?
I think the biggest reasons are sort of where they get an edge on one of those dimensions. So on the data dimension, if you have a really unique kind of experience or you have some way that people are interacting that really is not reflected in other situations, maybe it makes more sense for you to say, hey, we need to train on our own data because that has truly nothing to do with anything else. I'm honestly struggling to come up with a good example of that, but I've looked at some very niche apps of, this is specifically chess camp only for like 4 to 6 year olds, which is a very different vibe of how to have a conversation. Maybe something very niche like that. I think it's more commonly true that it's a technical advantage. That's not true for things like text and voice that are standardized, images as well. But UGC, obviously coming from gaming, this kind of moderation is a big topic that we hear about a lot. And usually when you're thinking about what are people building in my game, you can't just print out an image of it and say, oh, run that through the is it genitalia filter. You have to look at it from different angles. You have to think about how things can compose together. You have to think about, are they actually writing something in the game universe? Or all of those factors are going to be very specific to your ecosystem and require access to your ecosystem at a deeper level than just grabbing the text or grabbing the audio clips of what's being sort of said. So I think those are the situations where it makes more sense to try to build in-house when just you have access to that in a deeper way than an external partner would be able to.
Yeah, very interesting. One sort of final question here, and this is something that has come up when I've had this discussion with people as well, in terms of thinking about it, is one of the fears that some people have around doing the outsource buy decision is that it leads to sort of homogenization of the tools, that if everybody's using sort of the same tool, then it gets stuck with just, one or maybe two or three players in the space. Do you have any thoughts on that, or sort of how to think through that issue?
Yeah, I don't think I really buy it, to be honest. If you're building one thing internally, that itself is an echo chamber. Right. If you're pulling from external tools, if there was only one external tool that everyone was using, yes, I would have some concerns. Now, of course, there's configuration options and all that, but I would still have some concerns. But we're so amazingly far from that world. We are very much in a competitive ecosystem where there's a lot of different tools out there, bringing different approaches, different mentalities, handling different kinds of harms, some focused on the financial stuff, some focused on interpersonal. I don't think we're in any risk of everything calcifying into the exact same environment there. And I think by having more platforms talking openly to folks like vendors that do sort of operate in that in-between space, that actually sort of uplevels the whole conversation we're having as a collective industry, because now we're seeing all those different perspectives being gathered together in one place.
Cool. Very, very interesting. Yeah, this is such a fascinating topic, and I think it's something that a lot of people are thinking about. So I'm glad you wrote the blog post. I'm glad you're coming on the podcast to talk about it as well. And I'm sure there will be many more conversations along this line. But thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. Always happy to chat.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.